The signal hit the Carthage's forward array at 3:47 local, and Lieutenant Commander Marin Solis knew within 9 seconds that everything she had trained for was about to go wrong. She was standing at the signals interpretation station on the cruiser's Combat Information Center, one hand braced against the console rail, the other holding a mug of cold coffee she had forgotten to drink 3 hours ago. The Carthage was running dark transponders cold, active emissions zeroed, sliding through the Valen corridor on passive sensors alone. A stealth patrol. Routine. 37 days of nothing but background radiation, and the occasional tumbling, asteroid echoing off the hull like a fist on a drum. Then the signal arrived, and the drum stopped. It came in on a frequency the Terran Stellar Navy reserved for deep space hailing, a frequency that had never been used, because there had never been anyone to hail. The pulse was tight, coherent, and structured in a way that no natural source could produce. 3 nested carrier waves, each modulated against the others in a pattern that resolved, when Marin ran it through the translation matrix, into a mathematical proof. A simple one. The kind of proof a civilization would send if it wanted to say, "We know you are there, we understand structure, and we are coming to meet you." Marin set the coffee down. Her hand was steady, the rest of her was not. "Captain on deck," the watch officer called, and Commander Alexei Voss appeared at the CIC hatch wearing his duty jacket over a sleep shirt, his jaw set in the expression of a man who had been woken by an alarm he had always expected but never truly believed would sound. "Talk to me, Solis." "Structured signal on the TSN detail band, sir. Origin bearing 037 by +12, range indeterminate, but the wavefront density puts the source inside the corridor. Close. Less than 2 light towers." Voss crossed to the plot table. The Carthage's passive sensors painted the corridor in muted blues and grays, the cold cartography of empty space. Nothing showed at the signal's bearing. Nothing at all. "Anything on thermals?" "Negative. No thermal signature, no gravitational distortion, no M leakage beyond the signal itself. Whatever sent this is either very small or very good at hiding." Voss studied the plot for 4 seconds. "Classification." Marin met his eyes. "Sir, this is a first contact signal, structured, mathematical, and directed at our specific hailing frequency. Someone knows we're here, and they're announcing themselves." The CIC went quiet. 12 officers and enlisted crew, all of whom had run first contact drills 100 times and privately considered them academic exercises, stopped breathing at the same moment. Voss straightened. "General quarters, silent running holds. Wake the XO, the Marine Detachment Commander, and Dr. Osai. Solis, you have the signals chair. Nothing leaves this ship without my authorization." "Aye, sir." The Carthage came alive in the dark. A ship built to fight without being seen, preparing instead for something no Terran vessel had ever done. Marin pulled up the signal again and began disassembling it layer by layer, searching for the grammar beneath the mathematics, her fingers moving with a precision that contradicted the hammering in her chest. Somewhere ahead in the black silence of the Valen corridor, something was waiting, and it had called them by name. Dr. Adiz Osai arrived in the CIC 11 minutes later, her dark skin ashen under the red battle lighting, a tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. She was the Carthage's xenolinguistics officer, a title that had earned her gentle ribbing from every department head aboard since the day she reported. Humanity had no aliens to study. Her position was theoretical. It was no longer theoretical. "The signal's base layer is a mathematical identity proof," Marin told her, pulling the waveform onto the main display. "Nested primes, Fibonacci-adjacent sequencing, standard first contact indicators. But the second layer is different. It's not mathematics, it's relational." Osai leaned in, her eyes tracking the false color representation of the signal's internal structure. "Relational how?" Spatial mapping. The second layer encodes a three-dimensional coordinate grid anchored to pulsar timing signatures, the same pulsars we use for deep space navigation. They're telling us where they are. Marin highlighted a cluster of data points. And there's a third layer beneath that. I can't crack it yet. The encoding is denser, and it doesn't map to any mathematical framework I recognize. Show me. Marin isolated the third layer and expanded it across the display. It was beautiful in a way that made her uneasy, a cascading series of waveforms that folded into and through each other like a language made of light, each fold carrying information she could sense but not read. The patterns were too complex for mathematics and too structured for art. They sat in the gap between, and that gap was where meaning lived. I stared at it for a long time. This isn't a greeting. This is a vocabulary lesson. They're teaching us how to read them. How long to build a translation matrix. With this density, hours, maybe days. The grammar is nested, each element modifies every other element contextually. It's like trying to learn a language where every word changes meaning depending on the sentence it's in. We may not have days. Ose looked at her. Why not? Marin pulled up the navigational plot. Because the coordinate grid in the second layer isn't just telling us where they are, it's updating. The source point is moving toward us at point 3C, and it's been accelerating since the signal began. The number hung in the CIC like a held breath. Point 3C, 30% of the speed of light. No Terran vessel could match that velocity in normal space. Whatever was coming was faster than anything humanity had ever built. Voss stepped forward from the plot table. Time to contact. Marin ran the numbers. At current acceleration profile, the source will reach our position in 4 hours and 11 minutes. But if they're decelerating to match us, it could be sooner. If they're not decelerating, she paused. Then they're not planning to stop. Voss's jaw tightened. Solis, begin composing a response signal. Mirror their mathematical proof, add our own navigational grid, and include a standard Terran hailing package. Dr. Osai, work the third layer. I want to know what they're saying before they get here. Sir, Marin turned back to her station. One more thing. The signal is broadcasting on our deep hail frequency. That frequency is classified. It's never been transmitted outside Terran space. The implications settled over the CIC like frost. Someone had been listening to humanity's internal communications. Listening, learning, and waiting for the right moment to reach out. Voss looked at the plot, at the empty bearing where something impossibly fast was closing the distance, and said, "Then they've been watching us for a long time. Let's find out why." 40 minutes later, the XO and the Marine Detachment Commander arrived in CIC within seconds of each other. Commander Lin Tran was compact, precise, and had the unsettling habit of already knowing the answer before she asked the question. Major Kessler was a combat officer who had spent 20 years training for boarding actions against human adversaries, and now stood in a darkened CIC staring at the display like a man who had just learned that his entire career had been rehearsal for a play written in a language he couldn't read. "Brief me," Tran said. Marin walked them through the signal structure, the bearing, the velocity, and the classified frequency. Tran absorbed it in silence. Kessler's jaw worked once, twice, and then set. "What's the TSN protocol for confirmed first contact?" Tran asked. "Record everything," Marin said. "Transmit nothing without command authorization. Assess threat level. Report to Fleet Command at first opportunity." And Fleet Command is 47 light towers away at the nearest relay. Any message we send won't reach them for nearly 2 days. Whatever happens in the next 4 hours, we handle alone. Tran looked at Voss. "The ship is yours, Captain. What do you need from me?" "Keep the crew steady, and if this goes wrong, take the con and get them home." Tran nodded once and moved to the secondary command station. Kessler positioned his Marines at the CIC hatches, not because anyone expected boarding, but because training provided structure, and structure was the thing that kept fear from becoming paralysis. Meanwhile, Osai worked the third signal layer with an intensity that bordered on fury. She had commandeered 2 additional displays and was running the waveforms through every analytical tool in the Carthage's database, cross-referencing patterns against known mathematical constants, linguistic structures, even musical theory. Nothing fit. The third layer was something new, built on principles that human science had not yet categorized. At the 1-hour mark, Marin noticed something in the signal's timing that made her stomach tighten. She pulled up the raw data and ran the numbers twice to be certain. Dr. Osai, the signal isn't just repeating, it's adapting. Adapting how? The carrier frequency is shifting, slightly fractions of a hertz per cycle, but the drift isn't random, it's tracking our passive sensor emissions. Marin stared at her display. They can see our sensors. They know we're listening, and they're tuning the signal to match our equipment's optimal reception band. The implication was worse than the classified frequency. The classified frequency meant they had listened. The adaptive tuning meant they were listening now, in real time, adjusting their broadcast to ensure the Carthage received it at maximum clarity. They were not simply announcing themselves. They were demonstrating, with each passing minute, a deeper understanding of human technology than any first contact scenario had ever modeled. Osai stared at the drift data. Her expression shifted from frustration to something colder, the recognition that she was not studying an artifact. She was being studied. They're probing us, Osai said quietly. The signal isn't just a message, it's a diagnostic. Every time we adjust our reception, they read the adjustment and recalibrate. They're mapping our sensor capabilities through our own passive emissions. Voss absorbed this without visible reaction. Can we stop the leak? Not without shutting down our passive arrays entirely. And if we do that, we're blind. Then we stay visible. Better to be read than to be deaf. Voss turned to Marin. How much have they learned about us? From the sensor mapping, our reception bands, our frequency sensitivity, our passive detection range. From the classified frequency, our communications protocols and internal channel structure. Marin met his eyes. Sir, by the time they arrive, they'll know the Carthage better than most of our own crew does. Then we'd better make sure they also know we're not easily pushed. At 90 minutes, the signal changed again. The pulse rate doubled, the nested layers compressing into a denser, more urgent pattern that Marin's monitoring software flagged as a structural shift. Something was happening on the other end. The source was either responding to a stimulus or ramping toward a threshold, and neither possibility was comforting. New modulation pattern, Marin reported. The signal's internal clock just accelerated. The mathematical proof is repeating at twice the original rate, and the third layer is expanding. New waveform elements are being added in real time. Osai swore softly in a language Marin didn't recognize and bent closer to her displays. They're adding vocabulary. Whatever the third layer is, they're building more of it as they approach. This isn't a static broadcast. It's a live composition. Someone on that ship is writing this signal as we listen to it. The thought settled into Marin's mind and stayed there. Somewhere ahead in the dark, moving at 30% of the speed of light, an alien being was composing a message in real time, adapting it to the Carthage's responses, building a language on the fly. Not a recording, not a program. A person, reaching across the void, improvising the first conversation between two civilizations that had never heard each other speak. The awe was there again, a faint pressure behind her sternum, the recognition that what she was witnessing was unprecedented in the history of human experience. She acknowledged it and set it aside. There would be time for wonder later. Right now, something was approaching at a velocity that suggested it was not accustomed to being made to wait. 2 hours into the approach, the third signal layer cracked open, and Marin wished it hadn't. OS had built a provisional translation matrix by cross-referencing the relational structures in the third layer with the mathematical and spatial data in the first two. The result was fragmentary, ambiguous, and deeply unsettling. The third layer was not a vocabulary lesson. It was a warning. The aliens OS, I was calling them the Kaedrath, a word extracted from the signal's self-referential identifier, were not a single ship. The signal's spatial data, once decoded, revealed a fleet. 14 distinct mass signatures, arrayed in a formation that Marin's tactical training immediately recognized as a screening pattern. A lead element flanking escorts and a rear guard. A military formation. And the warning, stripped to its bones by OSI's matrix, said this: "We are the Kaedrath Ascendancy. We have observed your expansion. We have determined that you are a territorial species. We are coming to establish the boundary. Resistance to the boundary will be answered." Marin read the translation 3 times, each pass sharpening the cold knot in her stomach. This was not the first contact she had imagined. Not the exchange of mathematics and music, the slow building of shared understanding across the gulf between worlds. This was an ultimatum delivered in advance, wrapped in the courtesy of a structured signal, by a civilization that had already decided what humanity was and what humanity would be permitted to do. "Captain," Marin kept her voice level. "The signal is a territorial declaration. They're coming to draw a line, and they expect us to accept it." Voss read the translation on the main display. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation replacing surprise. "Dr. Osai, confidence level. 60% on the core meaning. The nuances are uncertain, the grammar shifts tone depending on context, and I may be reading hostility where there's formality. But the spatial data is harder to misread. They've included a proposed boundary line, and it runs through the heart of Terran-claimed space. They want us to withdraw from 6 star systems, including the Valen corridor. Including the corridor we're currently patrolling." "Yes, sir." Voss turned to the tactical officer. "Lieutenant Chen, what do we have on those mass signatures?" Lieutenant Rui Chen had been working the passive sensor data since the signal arrived, and his face carried the careful blankness of a man holding bad news. 14 contacts, sir. The lead signature is massive. I'm reading a displacement consistent with a vessel approximately 4 kilometers in length. The escorts are smaller, between 800 meters and 1.2 kilometers. The formation is tight and disciplined. They're running with minimal M leakage, which suggests either very clean power systems or active emission control. Weapons signatures. Nothing definitive on passive, but the escort formation is consistent with a combat screen. They're configured for threat response, not diplomacy, sir. Voss was silent for 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, Marin watched his posture settle into the particular stillness of a commanding officer who had made his decision, and was now simply informing the universe. Solis, transmit the following response on the same frequency. In their format, using OSI's matrix. Message reads: "We are the Terran Stellar Navy Cruiser Carthage. We acknowledge your signal and your presence. We do not accept territorial declarations made under threat of force. We propose a meeting at neutral coordinates to discuss mutual interests. If you approach our position in a combat formation, we will interpret that as hostile intent and respond accordingly." Marin composed the signal, encoded it through OSI's matrix, and transmitted it. The Carthage's brief emission flared into the dark and was gone, a single pulse of defiance aimed at 14 warships closing at 30% of the speed of light. She leaned back from the console. The message was out. There was nothing to do now but wait and watch the passive displays for a reply. Around her, the CIC hummed with the controlled tension of a crew that had trained for combat and was now facing something that no training scenario had covered. Chen was running continuous updates on the fleet's mass signatures, refining his displacement estimates, plotting deceleration curves that the incoming vessels showed no sign of following. Kessler stood at the aft hatch with his arms crossed, watching the displays with the focused stillness of a man who had accepted that his Marines' training was irrelevant to the current situation, but whose discipline would not allow him to stand down. Tran moved between stations with quiet efficiency, checking readiness reports, verifying damage control assignments, doing the 100 small things that kept a warship's crew functional when the universe was rewriting the rules. The response came in 9 minutes, not a signal this time. The Kaedrath fleet began to accelerate. At 3 hours and 18 minutes, Marin got her first visual. The Carthage's passive optical array, a telescope system designed to operate without active emissions, captured the light of the Kaedrath fleet as it entered the outer range of resolution. The lead vessel appeared first, a shape that Marin's brain struggled to categorize because it violated every assumption she held about ship design. It was organic. Not organic in the way that human engineers sometimes described curved hull forms, genuinely organic, as though the ship had been grown rather than built. The hull was a deep, shifting blue-black, its surface rippling with patterns that looked like bioluminescence, faint pulses of light running along channels that might have been veins or conduits or something for which humanity had no word. The ship's silhouette was elongated and asymmetric, a shape that suggested a deep-ocean predator more than a spacecraft, and its 4-kilometer length was rendered more imposing by the fact that it had no visible engines. It moved without thrust. It moved as though the universe itself was carrying it forward. The escorts were smaller versions of the same design, their hulls pulsing in synchronized patterns that Marin realized with a chill were communication. The fleet was talking to itself through light, a conversation happening at the speed of biology, and the Carthage was watching it like a lone hunter observing a pack signal it couldn't decode. "That's not metal," Chen said quietly from his station. "The hull composition I'm reading carbon lattice structures, silicate matrices, and something my database can't identify. It's armor, but it's grown armor, bioengineered at the molecular level. Weapons analysis. Hard to separate from the hull biology, sir. I'm seeing concentrated energy nodes along the forward section of the lead vessel. Could be weapons, could be sensor clusters, could be something we don't have a category for. The energy output from the nodes is significant, but I can't determine whether it's offensive or metabolic. Everything about these ships blurs the line between technology and biology." "Thermal profile?" Voss asked. "Almost nothing, sir. The hull radiates at background temperature. Either they've perfected thermal management or the ship's biology handles heat dissipation natively. I can't distinguish them from cold space at anything beyond optical range. If they weren't broadcasting the signal, we wouldn't know they existed until visual contact." The irony of that observation was not lost on anyone in the CIC. The Terran Stellar Navy's most advanced stealth technology had been designed to achieve exactly what the Kaedrath fleet accomplished through biology: invisibility to sensors, thermal silence, electromagnetic absence. Two species, separated by an unknown gulf of evolution, had converged on the same solution to the same problem. The difference was that the Carthage hid through engineering. The Kaedrath hid through nature. Marin stared at the image on her display. She had spent her career preparing for this moment, studying every theoretical model of alien vessel design, running simulations, writing papers on signal interpretation protocols that had earned her the signals chair on the Navy's most advanced stealth cruiser. None of it had prepared her for the reality. The Kaedrath fleet was alien in a way that went beyond technology. It was alien in its assumptions about what a ship could be, what space travel looked like, what power meant. These vessels didn't burn fuel. They didn't radiate waste heat. They communicated through their own skin. They were less machines than organisms, and they moved through space with the silent, patient certainty of predators who had never encountered something they couldn't consume. And they were beautiful, even through the cold lens of the tactical display, even knowing that those ships were coming to dictate terms under threat of force. The Kaedrath fleet was the most beautiful thing Marin had ever seen. She felt awe rise through her chest like a tide, a primal response to something vast and unknowable, and she let it come. She let it fill her for 3 heartbeats. Then she set it down, because awe was a luxury and the Kaedrath were not decelerating. "Captain," she said, "they're not slowing. Current closure rate puts them at weapons range in 47 minutes, and they've shifted formation. The escorts are spreading into a crescent. That's an envelopment pattern." Voss nodded once. He had already seen it. "All hands battle stations. Weapons free on my command only. Helm, maintain current heading and speed. We do not run." Jen pulled up the formation overlay on the tactical display. The crescent was tightening, the 2 outermost escorts curving inward to close the envelopment's trailing edge. In 4 minutes they would form a complete ring around the Carthage's position. Any ship inside that ring, moving at conventional acceleration, would have no escape vector that didn't cross a Kaedrath firing arc. Any conventional ship. The Carthage held its course, a single stealth cruiser 700 meters long, running dark in the path of 14 alien warships that collectively outmassed it by a factor of 80. The math was brutal and simple: outgunned, outmassed, outnumbered, and out-technologied by a civilization that had been watching humanity long enough to learn its classified frequencies. But the Carthage had one advantage the Kaedrath could not have accounted for, because they had never seen it in action. The Terran Stellar Navy did not build its stealth cruisers to hide. It built them to choose. To choose when to be seen. To choose the geometry of the engagement. To choose the moment when the dark stopped being a shield and became a weapon. Marin felt the shift in the ship around her, the subtle change in vibration, as the Carthage's weapons systems came online behind their emission-dampened housings. The cruiser's main battery was a spinal-mounted mass driver capable of accelerating a tungsten penetrator to 4% of the speed of light. Its secondary armament was a distributed array of directed energy weapons. And its tertiary system, the one the Kaedrath truly could not have anticipated, was the Carthage itself, a ship designed to be invisible until the instant it struck, and then to be somewhere else before the enemy could respond. Kessler's Marines had taken up positions throughout the ship, not at boarding stations but at damage control posts. There was nothing to board and nothing that could board the Carthage in the conventional sense, but the discipline of placement kept 37 Marines focused, occupied, and ready. Marin could hear the distant clatter of emergency bulkhead checks being run through the portside corridor, the sounds of a crew preparing for something that had no precedent. Tran appeared at Marin's station, Soli's personal assessment. "Not for the log." Marin considered the question. "They sent a vocabulary lesson wrapped around an ultimatum. That's contradictory. You don't teach someone your language if you plan to erase them. You teach your language to someone you intend to coexist with on your terms." Tran's expression didn't change, but her eyes moved to the navigational plot, to the 14 mass signatures closing the gap. "Then they want to talk. They just want to talk from a position of overwhelming strength." "Yes, ma'am." "And what does the Carthage represent to that calculation?" Marin looked at her own display, at the stealth cruiser's tactical profile glowing in muted blue against the dark plot. A variable they didn't account for. They built their approach around what they could observe. "We're about to show them the part they couldn't." Tran nodded and returned to her station without another word. But Marin noticed that the XO's hand rested on the edge of her console for a moment longer than necessary, the only sign that Commander Lin Tran, who had served 22 years in the Terran Stellar Navy without ever doubting a tactical assessment, was uncertain for the first time in her career. At 41 minutes to contact, The Kaedrath sent a second signal. Osa translated it in real time, her voice tight with the effort of parsing alien grammar under combat lighting. They're repeating the territorial declaration. Same boundary coordinates, but there's a new element, a countdown. They're giving us a window to withdraw. 17 minutes. 17 minutes. The precision of it struck Marin as significant. Not a round number. Not an arbitrary deadline. The Kaedrath had calculated exactly how long it would take the Carthage, at its maximum observed acceleration, to clear the boundary they had drawn. They had done the math on humanity's ships. They knew what the Carthage could do. They did not know what the Carthage was. Solis, Voss said, one more transmission, same format. Message reads, we do not withdraw from our own space. We remain open to dialogue. The boundary you propose is not acceptable. We suggest you decelerate and hold position. Marin sent it. The signal vanished into the dark. This time the response came in 43 seconds. Not an acceleration, not a formation change, something worse. The lead Kaedrath vessel lit up. Marin watched the optical feed as the 4-kilometer flagship began to glow along its bioluminescent channels, the faint pulses becoming steady streams of blue-white light that ran from the vessel's core to its leading edge, converging at a point on the prow that brightened until the optical filters engaged automatically. It was charging something. A weapon, a drive system, a communication device Marin didn't know, and it didn't matter, because the energy output the passive sensors registered in that single moment exceeded anything in the Terran database by 3 orders of magnitude. Energy spike, Chen reported, his voice cracking at the edges. Directed energy buildup on the lead vessel's forward section. Magnitude, Captain, the magnitude is off the scale. If that fires at full power at close range, it could sterilize a continent. Time to firing threshold. Unknown, sir. The charge curve doesn't match any model I have. Could be minutes, could be seconds. Voss did not hesitate. Helm, emergency lateral translation, bearing 180 relative. All departments brace for combat maneuvering. Solis decloak the beacon. Marin's fingers were already moving. The decloak beacon was the Carthage's ace, the device that existed for exactly this scenario, the moment a stealth cruiser needed to announce itself not as a whisper, but as a shout. She activated the system and felt the ship shudder as the emission-dampening field collapsed in a controlled sequence. The Carthage's full electronic signature flooding into space like a flare in a dark room. For 14 seconds the Carthage was visible, fully, unmistakably visible. A 700-meter Terran stealth cruiser, weapons ports open, main battery aligned, every sensor on the ship painting the Kaedrath fleet with targeting data that no amount of bioengineered armor could deflect. The purpose of the decloak was not to fight. Not yet. The purpose was to show. To say, this is what was hiding in your corridor, 10,000 kilometers from your formation for the last 3 hours, and you never saw it. You never knew. You have been observed, measured, and targeted by something you could not detect. And the only reason you are learning this now is because it chose to tell you. The Kaedrath fleet's response was immediate and chaotic. The formation broke. Escorts scattered outward, their bioluminescent patterns flaring into rapid, discordant pulses, alarm signals, Marin realized. Panic signals. The flagship's weapon charge faltered, its forward glow flickering as the vessel's systems redirected energy to sensors, to defenses, to whatever the Kaedrath equivalent of target acquisition was. They were looking for the Carthage. Sweeping the space with every detection system they had, trying to lock onto the thing that had materialized from nothing. But the Carthage was already gone. 14 seconds of visibility, and then the emission-dampening field re-engaged. The cruiser's drives fired a single calculated burst, translating the ship 3,000 kilometers along a vector the Kaedrath could not have predicted, and the dark swallowed it whole. Silent, invisible, somewhere else entirely. The Kaedrath fleet hung in space, formation shattered, weapons half-charged, searching for a ship that had appeared from nothing, shown them exactly what it was, and vanished again before they could draw a bead. Marin checked the Carthage's position against the Kaedrath search patterns. The escorts were sweeping in expanding spirals from the point of decloak, their bioluminescent sensor pulses painting the void in overlapping arcs. The patterns were systematic and thorough. They were also useless. The Carthage's emission-dampening technology didn't merely suppress the ship's emissions, it absorbed and recycled the ambient radiation that would otherwise bounce off the hull. To the Kaedrath sensors, the cruiser's location was indistinguishable from empty space. Not hidden, absent, as if the ship had never been there at all. On the Carthage's passive displays, Marin watched their confusion unfold. The escorts circled the flagship in widening arcs, their bioluminescent pulses rapid and dissonant, a conversation conducted in panic, each ship asking the others the same question. Where did it go? The flagship's energy weapon had powered down entirely, its forward glow extinguished, the massive vessel now radiating the frantic light language of a predator that had just learned it was being hunted. Marin felt the awe transform. It didn't disappear. It changed shape. The vast, unknowable beauty of the Kaedrath fleet was still there, still real, still staggering in its implications about what biology could become when given enough time and evolutionary pressure. But it was joined now by something harder and older, the determination of a woman who understood that beauty did not exempt anything from the rules of engagement, and that the rules of engagement were the only thing standing between first contact and first war. She keyed the communications panel. "Dr. Osai, I need a new signal. Same format. This message, we have demonstrated our capability. We can see you. You cannot see us. We do not wish to fight. We wish to talk. Decelerate and hold position, and we will approach openly." Osai composed the signal with hands that shook. Marin transmitted it into the dark, aimed at a fleet that was still looking for a ship standing 3,000 kilometers from where they were searching. For 7 minutes, nothing happened. The Kaedrath fleet drifted in its broken formation, escorts circling in agitated patterns, the bioluminescent communication channels firing in sequences too rapid for Osai's matrix to decode. They were arguing. Marin could see it in the way the light patterns clashed, different frequencies overlapping, drowning each other out, the visual equivalent of voices raised in a room where no one was listening. Then the flagship's lights shifted. The discordant pulses steadied into a single, deep, rhythmic frequency, a command tone, Marin realized. The Kaedrath equivalent of an admiral raising a hand for silence. One by one, the escorts matched the frequency. The argument ended, and the flagship began to decelerate. The meeting happened in the space between. The Carthage decloaked at a range of 5,000 kilometers, running with full transponder and navigation lights, every weapon powered down, approaching the Kaedrath flagship at a walking pace. Marin felt the emission-dampening field drop and the ship's full electronic signature flood outward, and with it went the last layer of protection between the Carthage's crew and the consequences of being seen. It was the most exposed she had ever felt. The stealth cruiser's armor was adequate against conventional threats, but without the cloak it was just a ship, a 700-meter piece of metal in the open dark, watched by 14 alien vessels whose combined firepower could reduce it to expanding gas. Every officer in the CIC understood what this approach meant. Voss was not sending a warship. He was sending a gesture. The Carthage was approaching openly, weapons cold, cloak down, because the only way to prove that the species hiding in the dark was not a threat was to stop hiding. And the only way to stop hiding was to accept that every Kaedrath weapon in the formation had a clean firing solution on a defenseless target. Marin's fingers rested on the decloak controls. If anything went wrong, she could have the emission-dampening field back online in 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time when a directed energy weapon traveled at the speed of light. She kept her fingers where they were and watched the range counter tick down. The Kaedrath flagship was even more staggering at close range. Its bioengineered hull moved, not the mechanical motion of articulated panels it rippled. The surface flowed like the skin of a living thing, and in the channels between the flowing plates, the bioluminescent light pulsed in rhythms that Marin's hindbrain interpreted as a heartbeat. The ship was alive, or close enough to alive that the distinction carried no practical weight. "Open a direct channel," Voss said. "Audio and visual, let them see us." "Sir, if they see the interior of the CIC, they'll gain intelligence on our." "Let them see us, Lieutenant Commander. They've already proven they can intercept our classified frequencies. A camera angle of the CIC isn't going to shift the balance. What might shift it is a face." Marin opened the channel. The main display split, one half showing the approaching flagship, the other half showing the Carthage's CIC as the Kaedrath would see it. A room full of humans, uniformed, armed, tense but present, visible, choosing to be seen. The response came 30 seconds later. The Kaedrath opened their own channel, and Marin saw the interior of an alien vessel for the first time in human history. It was like looking into the inside of a cathedral made of coral. The walls curved in organic spirals, surfaces textured with ridges and channels glowing with the same bioluminescence as the hull. The lighting was dim, blue-shifted, emanating from the walls themselves rather than any discrete source. And at the center of the space, standing on a platform that rose from the floor like a stalagmite, was a Kaedrath. Marin's breath caught. She had imagined aliens 1,000 times. Nothing had prepared her for the reality of an alien face looking back at her through a screen. The Kaedrath was tall, perhaps 2.5 meters, with a body structure that echoed the same organic asymmetry as their ships. Its torso was armored in natural chitin, dark blue-black plates overlapping in a pattern that looked both functional and ornamental. Its head was elongated, with a wide jaw and 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern, each eye independently mobile and currently fixed on different parts of the Carthage's CIC feed. Its 4 arms, the upper pair larger and ending in broad, 3-fingered hands. The lower pair, smaller and more precise, were spread in a gesture Marin could not read. It spoke. The sound came through as layered tones, multiple vocal tracks producing harmonics that the human ear could hear but the human brain struggled to parse. Osai's matrix caught fragments, and she translated in real time, her voice steady despite the sweat on her temples. "They're saying loosely, you were not what we expected. We came to set a boundary with a lesser species, a species that could be defined and contained. You are not lesser, your hiding was total. We could not perceive you. We must reconsider what you are. There's a conditional I can't fully parse, if you are what your signal claims." Voss stepped closer to the camera pickup. "Tell them this, Dr. Osai, as precisely as you can. We are the Terran Stellar Navy. We do not claim to be greater or lesser than any other species. We claim to be here. We have been here and we will remain. We do not draw boundaries for other species, and we do not accept boundaries drawn for us. We propose instead a meeting point, a place in space where neither side holds advantage, where we can begin the work of understanding each other. First contact does not have to be a line in the sand. It can be a door." Osa encoded and transmitted the message. Marin watched the Kaedrath commander's 4 eyes as it processed the translation. Each eye tracked different data, and then, slowly, deliberately, all 4 converged on the camera. On Voss, on the face of a single human offering something the Kaedrath had not expected to receive. The commander's upper hands folded inward, broad fingers interlocking in a gesture that rippled down its body, the chitin plates shifting apart to reveal softer tissue beneath. Vulnerability. Deliberate vulnerability. Marin recognized it the way she had recognized the mathematics in the signal, not through training, but through instinct, the deep understanding that a creature showing its unarmored parts was making a conscious choice. The reply came in harmonics that Osai translated with tears standing in her eyes. They say, "We came to draw a line, you showed us a door. We did not know you could hide so completely and still choose to stand in the open. A species that chooses visibility is not prey and is not predator. We do not have a category for what you are. We will learn one. We accept the meeting place." Marin felt the tension in the CIC shift not breaking, but transforming, the sharp edges of combat readiness softening into something cautious and fragile and unprecedented. Around her, officers who had been ready to fight were instead witnessing something no training manual had covered: the first tentative reach across the gap between species. But it wasn't over. The escort that fired did so without warning and, as near as Marin could determine afterward, without authorization from the flagship. One of the Kaedrath flanking vessels, a 1,200-meter escort running on the formation's outer edge, broke from its holding pattern at high acceleration, its bioluminescent channels flaring red in a pattern starkly different from the flagship's steady blue-white. It closed the distance to the Carthage in 11 seconds, and in the 12th second, it fired. The weapon was a directed energy pulse, concentrated and precise, and it struck the Carthage's port armor belt with a force that threw Marin sideways against her console. Alarms screamed through the CIC. The lighting shifted from standard to damage control red. The deck shuddered with the deep, grinding vibration of hull plating, absorbing an impact it was never designed to absorb while running decloaked. "Contact bearing port beam, range 1,200 meters, hostile fire," Chen shouted over the alarms. "Direct hit on the port armor belt, sections 7 through 9. Hull integrity holding but degraded. Another hit on the same vector will breach. Second energy buildup detected on the hostile. They're charging." Voss's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Helm, emergency lateral translation starboard. Weapons, target the firing vessel only. Solis, recloak and paint." The Carthage moved. In combat, the stealth cruiser's advantage was not armor or raw firepower, it was agility and invisibility, and both systems engaged simultaneously. The emission-dampening field snapped back into place, and the drives fired a rapid lateral translation that put 3,000 meters of empty space between the cruiser and the escort's second shot. The directed energy pulse burned through the vacuum the Carthage had occupied a half-second earlier, hitting nothing. "Recloaked," Marin confirmed, painting the target. She locked the targeting array onto the rogue escort, feeding fire control data to every weapon station. The enemy vessel was clear on her display, 1,200 meters of bioarmored aggression, still accelerating, still charging its weapon, hull flashing red in frantic pulses. It was hunting for the Carthage, sensor arrays sweeping the space where the cruiser had been. But the Carthage was no longer where it had been. And the escort's sensors, Marin noted with grim satisfaction, were not finding it. "Weapons hot," the weapons officer reported. "Main battery aligned, secondaries locked." Voss watched the display. His eyes moved from the rogue escort to the Kaedrath flagship, where the commander's image still held one half of the split screen. The commander's 4 eyes were wide, its chitin plates locked rigid, and Marin did not need Osai's matrix to read the emotion on that alien face. Shock. Horror. The flagship had not authorized this. "The flagship is transmitting," Osai confirmed, her words rapid. "They're ordering the escort to stand down. The harmonics are urgent, almost frantic. They're using a word I translate as unsanctioned or rogue. The flagship explicitly did not authorize the attack. They're also transmitting to us an apology, formal, structured. They're asking us not to destroy the escort. They say the crew acted from fear, not command." Voss's expression hardened. "I believe them, but that escort is still charging a weapon aimed at my ship. Solis, transmit to the flagship. We will neutralize the rogue vessel with minimum force. Request they do not intervene. Marin sent the message. The flagship's reply came in 4 seconds, a single harmonic that Os translated as unconditional assent. Weapons, Voss said, disable that escort. Drives and weapons only. I want it stopped, not destroyed. The Carthage fired from the dark. The main battery's tungsten penetrator crossed 3,000 meters in a fraction of a second, striking the rogue escort's aft section with surgical precision. The round punched through the bioengineered armor at the juncture between 2 chitin plates and detonated inside the drive assembly. The escort's propulsion died in a cascade of failing bioluminescence, the hull going dark from stern to midships like a flame being smothered. The secondary directed energy array fired a concentrated 2-second burst at the escort's forward weapon mount, the beam cutting through the bioarmor along the charging channels, disrupting the energy buildup before it could resolve into a second shot. The weapon mount went dead. The escort tumbled, powerless and toothless, its hull dimming to the faint residual glow of a living ship in biological shock. No kill, no overkill. 1 round, 1 burst, 2 systems neutralized, the vessel intact, its crew alive. 12 seconds of violence that said more about humanity than any signal ever could. The CIC was silent except for the steady pulse of damage reports from the port armor belt. Marin's hands were shaking not from fear, but from the intensity of compression. Years of training and preparation funneled into 12 seconds, where precision was the difference between first contact and first war. The Kaedrath flagship was moving now, not toward the Carthage, toward its own disabled escort. The massive vessel drifted forward with the slow, deliberate motion of a parent approaching a wayward child, its channels shifting to deep amber. The rogue escort's remaining lights flickered and then steadied, matching the flagship's frequency. Compliance. Submission. Around the flagship, the other escorts had gone still. 13 vessels, each one capable of firing on the Carthage, and not one of them had moved. They had watched one of their own fire without authorization, watched the invisible human ship disable it with 2 precisely placed shots, and they had chosen to stay exactly where they were. Marin didn't know if that was discipline, or fear, or something else entirely. She suspected it was the beginning of respect. On the visual channel, the Kaedrath commander had turned away from the camera. Its 4 eyes were tracking something on its own displays, the disabled escort's status, Marin guessed, or the internal fleet communications that were still flickering in rapid, chastened patterns across the formation. The 2 younger Kaedrath who would later appear as historians were visible in the background, their lighter chitin catching the blue glow of the coral walls, their smaller hands moving in gestures that Marin had no context to read, but that carried the unmistakable rhythm of urgency. Something was being decided inside the flagship, something that went beyond the immediate crisis. The commander turned back. It spoke a single phrase, 3 harmonics layered over a bass tone that resonated at a frequency Marin's console flagged as significant. Osai translated with a frown of concentration. They're saying, "We will hold." That's all. 3 words. But the harmonic structure carries a weight I haven't seen in any of the other transmissions. It's a commitment, not a tactical decision, a promise. Tran materialized at Marin's shoulder. Damage report. Port armor belt sections 7 through 9 degraded to 43%. Structural integrity holding but compromised. If they'd hit us in the same spot again, we'd have a breach. Marin pulled up the engineering schematic. Repair crews are patching what they can, but we won't have full integrity until we reach a dock. And the cloak. Fully operational. The hit didn't touch the emission dampening arrays. They're distributed through the hull, not concentrated in the armor belt. We can still vanish whenever we need to. Tran studied the damage report. 1 hit. 1 hit from 1 escort, and we're at 43% on the port belt. The flagship's weapon was 3 orders of magnitude stronger than the escort's. Marin didn't answer, because the arithmetic was clear and the answer was worse than silence. If the flagship had fired instead of the escort, the Carthage would not be having this conversation. It would be expanding gas and debris, and first contact would have ended before it began. But the flagship hadn't fired. The flagship had been ready to fire, had charged its weapon to full, and had stopped. Because the Carthage had shown itself for 14 seconds and then vanished, and that single act had introduced enough uncertainty into the Kaedrath's tactical calculus to buy humanity a conversation instead of an obituary. 14 seconds. The margin between existence and extinction had been 14 seconds of visibility, and Marin had been the one to trigger the decloak. She filed that thought in the part of her mind where she kept things she would process later, after the mission, after the reports, after the adrenaline had burned down to something she could hold without shaking. Not now, now there was work. The Kaedrath commander reappeared on the visual channel. All four of its eyes were focused on a single point, the camera, Voss, the human who had been attacked and had answered with precision instead of annihilation. Osai translated the transmission in a voice gone very quiet with the weight of what she was saying. They say, "You struck without rage. You ended the threat and preserved the life. We have encountered many species in our expansion. We have fought territorial wars and absorbed civilizations. None have answered an unprovoked attack with restraint that precise. Your weapons are invisible and your mercy is deliberate. We understand now why you rejected the boundary. You do not need one drawn for you. You are the boundary." Voss let the words settle across the CIC. Then he said simply, "Tell them we look forward to the meeting. And tell them the escort's crew should receive medical attention. We targeted their drive and their weapons, nothing else. They should be alive and uninjured." Osai sent it. The reply was a single sustained harmonic, a frequency that resonated in Marin's chest like the low note of a cathedral organ. Osai didn't translate it aloud. She didn't need to. Every human in the CIC felt it, a tone of gratitude expressed not in words but in the frequency of a living ship's heartbeat, offered without reservation to the species that had fought its first engagement against an alien enemy and won it with 2 shots and 0 deaths. Marin looked around the CIC. Chen was running post-engagement analysis with hands that had stopped trembling. Tran stood at the secondary command station, already composing the first contact report that would eventually reach Fleet Command. Kessler had shifted his Marines from damage control posts to standard watch rotation, because the fight was over and routine was the only medicine that worked on soldiers who had just survived their first alien engagement. Osai was deep in the translation matrix, refining her understanding of Kaedrath harmonics with the focused intensity of a woman who had just proved that her entire theoretical career had been building toward a single, irreplaceable moment. And Voss stood at the center of it all, hands behind his back, watching the Kaedrath flagship on the main display. His face showed nothing. His posture said everything. The Carthage's captain had been given an ultimatum by a superior force, refused it, fought a skirmish he hadn't started, won it without killing, and offered peace in the same breath. He would never say so, and no commendation would capture it, but Marin knew she was looking at the man who had just set the template for how humanity would conduct itself among the stars. She hoped it would be enough. The Kaedrath fleet held position for 6 hours while the flagship recovered its disabled escort. During that time, Marin worked with Osai to expand the translation matrix, building a shared vocabulary word by word, concept by concept, laying the foundation for a language that neither species had spoken before but both were learning to hear. It was painstaking, exhausting work. The Kaedrath language was tonal, contextual, and carried emotional content in its harmonic structure, a concept with no human equivalent. A word in Kaedrath didn't simply mean something, it felt something, and the feeling was part of the meaning. The word for boundary carried an undertone of sorrow. The word for meeting carried an undertone of hope. And the word they had coined for the Carthage, The word Osai kept circling back to, trying to crack, carried an undertone she could only describe as reverence. At hour 2, a second escort, not the Rogue, a different vessel, broke formation briefly and moved toward the Carthage's last known position. It didn't fire. It didn't charge weapons. It swept the area with what Marin's sensors read as a broad-spectrum scan, mapping the space where the Carthage had decloaked and then vanished, looking for residual emissions, looking for a trace. It found nothing. The Carthage had translated to a position 1,900 kilometers from the search zone, and its emission-dampening field left no thermal wake, no ion trail, no magnetic signature. The escort circled the empty space for 4 minutes, its bioluminescent channels cycling through a pattern OS identified as confusion. Then it returned to formation. Marin logged the incident and noted the implication. The Kaedrath were still trying to understand how the Carthage's stealth worked. They weren't satisfied with the demonstration. They wanted data. And the fact that they couldn't get it, that the physics of human stealth technology was genuinely opaque to their sensory biology, was clearly disturbing them in a way that went beyond tactical concern. "They can't process what we do," Osai said, unprompted from her station. She had been monitoring the fleet's internal light communication and was piecing together fragments of their conversation. "Their entire perception model is based on presence. Everything that exists emits something: heat, light, gravitational influence, bioelectric fields. A thing that emits nothing is, to them, a thing that doesn't exist. We're not just hidden from their sensors. We're hidden from their ontology." "Their what?" Chen asked. "Their model of reality. To a Kaedrath, the universe is made of things that can be perceived. We broke that rule. They're not just recalculating our threat level, they're recalculating their entire understanding of what's possible." At hour 3, Voss authorized a cultural data exchange. Marin assembled and transmitted the package: mathematical proofs, navigational standards, and a curated introduction to human history. She chose the contents carefully, consulting with Osai on which concepts would translate through the matrix and which would collapse into noise. Not the wars, not the conquests, the moments of reaching. The first voyages across oceans when the horizon was a wall and the wind was the only engine. The first steps on a dead moon, taken not for conquest, but because the silence there was worth crossing a vacuum to hear. The first signals sent into deep space, aimed at no one, hoping for anyone, mathematical sequences broadcast toward stars that might not have planets, by a species that had no evidence it would ever be heard. The Kaedrath received the package and went silent for 90 minutes. Marin used the time to run a full diagnostic on the port armor belt, coordinate with engineering on temporary patches, and draft the preliminary sections of the first contact report. The mundane work of damage assessment and documentation, performed in a CIC that had, 7 hours earlier, been the most ordinary room on the most ordinary patrol in the Terran Stellar Navy. When they responded, the data they sent back was staggering. Not a history, a biology. The Kaedrath were not a species that had built ships. They were a species that had grown them, evolved a symbiotic bond with the organic vessels they piloted, experienced their fleet the way a human experienced a heartbeat. The ships were extensions of Kaedrath neurology. The bioluminescent communication wasn't technology, it was physiology. The fleet didn't carry a crew. The fleet was the crew, and the crew was the fleet, bound at the cellular level. And the rogue escort's attack, in Kaedrath terms, was the equivalent of a flinch, an involuntary reaction from a part of the collective that had panicked at the presence of something it could not perceive. To the Kaedrath, perception was existence. A ship that could not be perceived was a ship that did not exist, and something that did not exist but could still strike was a violation of their deepest biological reality. The Carthage's stealth had not merely surprised them, it had fundamentally disoriented them. Marin read the biological data and felt the awe settle into her bones, not the breathless, tidal awe of the first sighting, but a quieter thing. Understanding. These were not monsters. They were a species for whom the universe was a sensory experience mediated through living ships, and humanity had just introduced an impossibility into their sensory world. A ghost that could fight. The fact that the ghost had chosen to become visible had revealed itself voluntarily, at risk to itself, because talking required being seen was, to the Kaedrath, the most significant act of the entire encounter. Not the weapons, not the tactical precision, the choice to stop hiding. At hour 4, Marin noticed something on the passive optical feed that stopped her cold. The disabled escort, the rogue that had fired on the Carthage, was healing. The hull breaches where the tungsten penetrator and the directed energy burst had struck were closing, not being repaired by external crews. Closing on their own, the bioengineered armor regenerating around the wound sites like tissue knitting over a cut. The process was slow, far slower than the original damage, but it was unmistakable. Given time, the escort would be whole again. "Are you seeing this?" she asked Chen. "I see it." His voice was steady, but she could hear the edge beneath. "The armor has a regenerative capacity. If their other vessels have the same biology, conventional weapons would need to achieve a kill threshold on the first strike. Anything less, and the target heals." The tactical implications settled into the CIC like a weight. The Carthage's two-shot engagement had disabled the escort precisely, because it had targeted the drive and weapons system specifically. But if the hull itself could regenerate, then a war of attrition against the Kaedrath would be a war humanity could not win. Not with kinetics. Not with directed energy. Not with any weapon that damaged without destroying. Marin filed that assessment in her report and marked it priority. Then she turned back to the translation work, because the best way to avoid a war of attrition was to avoid war entirely, and the language being built between the Carthage and the Kaedrath flagship was the most valuable weapon either species possessed. At hour 5, the Kaedrath commander requested a second visual exchange. This time it was not alone on its platform. Two smaller Kaedrath flanked it younger. Marin guessed from the lighter chitin and the way their eyes moved faster, processing more frantically. They carried devices that pulsed with the same bioluminescence as the ship's walls. Recording devices. Historians. The commander spoke at length, and Osai translated with growing confidence as the matrix deepened. "They are formally recording this exchange for the Ascendancy's archives. They want it known that the species designated Terran, that's us, demonstrated 3 capabilities the Kaedrath had never encountered in combination: total concealment, voluntary revelation, and precise restraint under fire. They are classifying this encounter as the closest translation is a teaching. Not a battle, not a negotiation. A teaching. We taught them something about what a species can be." Voss turned to Marin. "Ensure the full recording package is queued for burst transmission to Fleet Command the moment we have relay access. Every signal, every translation, every sensor log. Include Dr. Osai's matrix in full. If the Kaedrath reach out to another human vessel, our people need to be able to respond." Marin nodded and began compiling the package. It would be the most important data transmission in human history, and she assembled it with the same methodical precision she brought to every task. Header codes, timestamps, encryption keys, signal files indexed by layer, translation matrices tagged by confidence level. Sensor logs from the engagement, including the rogue escort's weapon signature, the flagship's energy weapon charge curve, and the regeneration data from the disabled escort's healing hull. Chen's thermal profiles, Osai's linguistic analyses, and the visual recordings, the first images of a Kaedrath face, a Kaedrath ship's interior, a Kaedrath commander choosing vulnerability over armor. She packaged it all and marked it for priority burst. When the Carthage reached relay range, humanity would learn in a single compressed transmission that it was no longer alone in the universe, and that the species it had met was powerful, alien, and willing to talk. Marin documented it all, line by line, building the record that would eventually reach Terran Stellar Navy Command, and reshape humanity's understanding of its place among the stars. She did not know, as she worked, that the Valen corridor would become the site of the first permanent meeting between human and Kaedrath delegations. She did not know that the word the Kaedrath had coined for the Carthage, the untranslatable one carrying the undertone of reverence, would become the name of the diplomatic station built at the coordinates where the cruiser had decloaked, Revethka. Os would eventually render it into English as the hidden thing that chose to be known. She did not know any of that. She knew only that she was sitting in a damaged CIC under red lighting, building a dictionary with a xenolinguist who had been told her job was theoretical, while a living alien ship held position 5,000 kilometers away, and its crew learned, word by painstaking word, that the universe was larger than they had allowed themselves to believe. Near the end of the 6th hour, Osai cracked the last untranslatable element in the Kaedrath commander's original transmission, the word that had been used to describe the Carthage. The word carried 3 simultaneous harmonic layers: a spatial concept, something that occupies space without being perceived; an emotional concept, the feeling of encountering the impossible; and a relational concept, an entity whose nature can only be understood through its choices, not its properties. It was, Osai explained with the quiet intensity of someone who had just discovered a new category of thought, a word that could not exist in a language built by a species that had never encountered something invisible. The Kaedrath had invented it in real time, during the encounter, to describe what the Carthage was. They coined a word for us, Osai said. Not a name, a concept. In the middle of a first contact event, while their fleet was scattered and their escort was disabled and their tactical assumptions were in ruins, their commander paused and invented a new word, because their language didn't have one for what we are. Marin thought about that. She thought about what it meant to meet a species so deeply embedded in language that its first response to the unprecedented was not to fight harder or retreat further, but to find a new word, to build a concept that could hold the shape of something that had never existed in their reality before. And she thought about the fact that she was doing the same thing, sitting at her console building translations, inventing bridges between meaning systems that had evolved a galaxy apart. She was a signals officer on a stealth cruiser. Her job was to interpret electromagnetic radiation. What she was actually doing, what she had been doing for the past 14 hours, was something no job title could capture. She was becoming the first human to speak Kaedrath. And somewhere on the flagship, a 4-eyed commander with chitin armor and 4 arms was becoming the first Kaedrath to understand English. Neither of them had signed up for this. Both of them were doing it anyway, because the alternative was silence. And silence between 2 armed civilizations was the distance between peace and war measured in the width of a word. At 600 local 14 hours and 13 minutes after the first signal had arrived on a frequency nobody expected, Marin saved her latest translation file, leaned back in her chair and looked at the main display. The Kaedrath flagship filled the screen, its bioluminescent channels pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. A heartbeat. A living ship, resting in the dark beside a human vessel that had fought it, spared it, and offered it a conversation instead of a corpse. She thought about what came next, not the treaty that would take years, not the politics that would take decades. The next word. The next translation. The next concept added to a language that did not exist yet but was being built, syllable by hard-won syllable, by 2 species that had looked across the void and chosen to keep talking rather than keep fighting. The Carthage held its position visible, battered, unbroken, standing on the line between what humanity had been and what it was becoming. Marin picked up her cold coffee, drank it, and went back to work. She had been at it for another 40 minutes when the Kaedrath flagship transmitted something new. Not a signal, not a harmonic message through the translation matrix. A navigational broadcast, raw coordinates, formatted in the shared grid they had built from pulsar timing, designating a point in space, exactly equidistant between the Carthage's position and the flagship's bow. A meeting point, physically, not just electronically. Captain, Marin put the coordinates on the main display. They're proposing a face-to-face, a specific location midway between us. No conditions attached, just the coordinates and a time stamp, 30 minutes from now. Voss studied the plot. The proposed point hung in the void, 5,000 meters of nothing between two civilizations that had spent the last 15 hours learning to say hello without shooting. Dr. Osai. Is this consistent with their cultural data? Osai looked up from her displays, her eyes red-rimmed from hours of unbroken work. More than consistent, it's significant. In the biological data they sent, there's a concept the Kaedrath don't have a word for trust, as we understand it. The closest equivalent is a compound concept that translates roughly as shared vulnerability in open space. To meet between the ships, in vacuum, with neither side protected by hull or armor, that's their version of extending a hand. Or extending a trap, Kessler said from the aft hatch. His voice carried no hostility, only the reflex of a man whose training demanded he say it. Major, Voss turned to face him. If they wanted to destroy us, they had the firepower to do it 6 hours ago. They didn't, and after the rogue escort fired, the flagship apologized before we even demanded it. This isn't a trap. This is what happens after a trap fails, someone decides to try honesty instead. Kessler's jaw worked once. Then he nodded. I'd like to put 2 Marines in the shuttle, sir, not as an assault team, as a security detail, armed but holstered. Agreed, Solis, you're coming, and Dr. Osai. 4 total, me, you 2, and 1 Marine. Kessler, pick your steadiest hand. Kessler didn't hesitate. Corporal Vasquez, she won't flinch if the devil himself shakes her hand. Then we go in 30. Voss looked at the main display one last time, the living flagship pulsing in the dark, patient and enormous and waiting. Tran, you have the con. If this goes wrong, you know what to do. Tran met his eyes. It won't go wrong, Captain, but if it does, yes, I know. The shuttle launched 19 minutes later, a blunt-nosed utility craft that had been designed to ferry cargo and personnel between ships in fleet anchorages. It was not built for diplomacy. It was not built for history. It was built to carry 12 tons of provisions across a vacuum, and now it carried 4 humans toward the first physical meeting between Homo sapiens and another intelligent species. Marin sat in the co-pilot's chair, running the shuttle's limited sensor suite, watching the Kaedrath flagship grow on the forward display as they closed the distance. At this range, the ship's organic hull filled the viewport, a wall of living armor stretching in every direction, its bioluminescent channels pulsing in that slow heartbeat rhythm she had learned to read as calm. The channels nearest the shuttle shifted color as they approached, deepening from blue-white to a warm amber that tracked their flight path like an eye-following movement. They're watching us, she said. I'd be worried if they weren't, Voss replied from the pilot's seat. A shape detached from the flagship's ventral surface. Not a shuttle, nothing so mechanical. It was a pod, roughly ovoid, its hull the same bioengineered material as the flagship but thinner, almost translucent. Through the shell, Marin could see light moving inside the bioluminescence of the occupants, their communication rendered visible through the pod's living skin. It descended toward the meeting coordinates on no visible thrust, moving with the same frictionless grace as the fleet itself. The 2 craft arrived at the midpoint within seconds of each other. Marin checked the environmental readings, hard vacuum, no radiation anomalies, no energy signatures beyond the pod's passive biology. Clean space, neutral ground. They're pressurizing, Osa said, leaning forward to read the sensor data. The pod is generating an atmosphere, extending it outward like a bubble. They're creating a shared environment, breathable for them at least. Composition. Nitrogen-oxygen mix. Close to Terran standard. Either they breathe something remarkably similar to us, or they've analyzed our atmospheric data and tailored the mix. Os paused. Given what they've already demonstrated, I'm betting on the latter. The atmospheric bubble expanded from the Kaedrath pod until it enveloped the shuttle's forward hull. Marin watched the pressure reading stabilize 1 atmosphere, 21% oxygen, temperature within survivable range. They had built a room in the void, furnished it with human-compatible air, and left the door open. Voss stood, helmets on, sidearms holstered. Osai, your point on communication. Solis, you record everything. Vasquez, you stand behind us and look professional. Nobody reaches for anything without my word. They suited up in silence. The shuttle's forward airlock cycled, and Marin stepped into the atmospheric bubble between the two craft, and the universe changed again. The Kaedrath commander was already there, standing on a platform that had grown from the pod's hull like a branch from a trunk. It was taller than she had judged from the screen, closer to 3 meters, its chitin armor catching the bioluminescent light from the pod behind it in patterns that shifted with each breath. Its 4 eyes found the 4 humans immediately, each eye locking onto a different member of the party, reading them simultaneously. 2 attendants flanked the commander, the younger Kaedrath she had seen earlier. The historians, their lighter chitin glowing faintly, with the effort of recording everything their biology could capture. They carried no devices that Marin could see. Their bodies were the recording devices, their neural architecture storing the encounter at the cellular level. The commander's upper hands unfolded in the gesture Marin recognized from the visual feed, broad fingers spreading outward, chitin plates parting to show the softer tissue beneath. Vulnerability offered. The gesture that had no human word but that every human present understood. Voss stepped forward. He was not a tall man, 5'10" in his duty boots, compact and squared, a career officer whose authority came from competence rather than physical presence. Standing before a 3-meter alien commander backed by a 4-kilometer living warship, he looked small. He also looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been given an impossible situation and had navigated it with precision, restraint, and a willingness to be seen. He extended his hand. The gesture crossed the gap between species, a primate reflex, an open palm showing no weapon, offered to a being whose evolutionary history had produced 4 arms and chitin armor instead of handshakes. The commander studied Voss's hand with 3 of its 4 eyes. The 4th tracked the hand's position relative to the holstered sidearm on Voss's hip. Then the commander reached down with its lower right hand, the smaller, more precise appendage, and wrapped 3 broad fingers around Voss's palm. The grip was gentle, controlled. The hand was warm, warmer than Marin expected, and the texture of the commander's skin against Voss's glove was rough, granular, like gripping sun-heated sandstone. The 2 of them stood there for 5 seconds, the human captain and the alien commander, connected by a clasp that neither species had been built for but that both recognized. Osai made a small sound beside Marin. Not a word. A breath, caught and released, the sound of a woman watching her life's theoretical work become flesh and chitin in the space between 2 ships. The commander spoke. The harmonics filled the atmospheric bubble, richer and more complex without the filter of electronic transmission. Marin could feel the lower frequencies in her sternum, vibrations that bypassed hearing and registered as physical sensation. Os, translated in a whisper. It says, I am Vithrin, voice of the Kaedrath Ascendancy. I came here to tell you where your boundary was. I am no longer certain that we are the ones who should be drawing boundaries. There's a harmonic modifier I haven't heard before. It qualifies everything. Like saying, I speak with the understanding that I may be wrong. Voss nodded slowly. Tell Vithrin this, boundaries are for walls, we'd rather build bridges. But a bridge requires 2 builders, and both must agree where it leads. Os encoded and spoke the translation aloud. her voice carrying the tonal harmonics she had practiced in the last hours, shaping human vocal chords around alien sound concepts. The result was imperfect. Marin could hear the gaps where human biology couldn't replicate Kaedrath frequency ranges, but the commander's four eyes widened, all four fixing on Os, with an intensity that had nothing to do with threat. It responded, a rapid series of harmonics, each layered and textured, the alien equivalent of speaking quickly because the words mattered too much to slow down. It's saying, you speak our language. You have been learning while we approached. Your signals officer decoded our grammar and your language officer learned to speak it. In the time it took us to cross the void, you built a bridge from your side. We did not expect this. We expected to arrive and dictate. Instead, we arrived and heard our own words spoken back to us by a species we had classified as territorial and reactive. Osai paused. We classified you incorrectly. Marin felt the weight of that admission settle through the bubble like a change in pressure. The Kaedrath Ascendancy, a civilization that communicated through living ships, that grew its technology from biology, that had expanded across unknown reaches of space, absorbing or containing every species it encountered, had looked at humanity and made an assumption. Territorial, reactive, containable. They had sent 14 warships to enforce that assumption. And they were standing here now, in a bubble of shared air between two vessels, admitting they were wrong. Not because the Carthage had outgunned them, not because humanity had proven itself more powerful, because a signals officer had decoded their grammar, a xenolinguist had learned their language, and a captain had answered an act of war with two precisely placed shots and an open hand. The commander Vithrin turned its gaze to Marin. 3 eyes on her face, one on the recording device clipped to her suit. It spoke directly to her, a shorter phrase, intimate in a way the formal declarations had not been. Osai translated, you are the one who read us. It's using the word they coined Revethka. The hidden thing that chose to be known. It's applying it to you personally, not just the ship. Marin met Vithrin's eyes, all 4 of them, cycling her gaze across the diamond pattern, unsure which one was the primary and then deciding it didn't matter. Tell the commander I'm still reading. We both are. That's the point. Osai translated. Vithrin's chitin plates shifted in the pattern Marin had learned to recognize as consideration, a physical rearrangement of armor that exposed different sensory surfaces, the Kaedrath equivalent of tilting one's head. Then the commander produced a sound that was not a word, a single sustained tone, low and resonant, that made the atmospheric bubble itself vibrate. The 2 historian attendants went rigid. Corporal Vasquez's hand twitched toward her sidearm before discipline locked it down. That's not language, Osai said quickly. I think that's biological, a commitment tone. Something embedded in Kaedrath physiology below the level of speech, an involuntary response to a decision that can't be reversed. The commander reached into the folds of its chitin with its upper left hand and withdrew an object. It was small, roughly the size of a human fist, and it glowed. A sphere of the same bioengineered material as the fleet's hulls, pulsing with light in patterns that Marin's trained eye recognized as data. Dense, structured, layered data, a library compressed into a living artifact. Vithrin held it out toward Voss, upper hand extended, chitin parted. The sphere, resting on 3 broad fingers, offered the way one would offer something fragile and irreplaceable. Osai translated the accompanying harmonic. This contains the navigational data for 317 star systems within the Kaedrath Ascendancy's charted space, trade routes, resource maps, population centers. It is the kind of information a species gives to an ally, not an adversary. We give it because we have decided that the boundary we came to draw is the wrong shape. A line keeps things apart. You proposed a door. This is what is on our side of it. Voss took the sphere. It was warm in his gloved hands, its bioluminescence shifting to match the rhythm of his pulse, reading his biology the way the signal had read the Carthage's sensors, adapting, synchronizing, finding the frequency of human life and matching it. "Captain," Marin kept her voice level, "that sphere just synced to your heartbeat." Voss looked down at the glowing object. Its light pulsed in time with his chest, amber and steady, an alien artifact beating in rhythm with a human heart. He looked up at Vithrin. "Tell the commander we accept the gift, and tell it that we will reciprocate. The navigational data for Terran-charted space will be compiled and delivered at the meeting point we agree on. Equal exchange, equal trust." Osai translated. Vithrin's response was the vulnerability gesture again, chitin plates parting. Softer tissue, exposed, held longer this time. Sustained. The alien equivalent of a bow held until the other party straightens. Behind the commander, the two historians pulsed with rapid light. Recording. Storing. Carrying this moment home in their cells to be read by a civilization that had sent a war fleet and received a handshake. They returned to the Carthage 40 minutes later. The shuttle docked, the airlock cycled, and Marin stepped back into the familiar confines of the cruiser's corridors with the disorientation of a woman returning from a place that existed outside every map she had ever learned to read. The sphere went to the Carthage's secure lab, where Chen and the science team began the slow process of interfacing with its biological data storage. The navigational information it contained would take weeks to fully extract and years to verify, but the preliminary data confirmed what Vithrin had promised. 317 star systems, mapped in detail that exceeded anything in the Terran database. The Kaedrath had opened a door, and behind it was a galaxy larger than humanity had imagined. Marin returned to the CIC. The port armor belt was still patched and degraded. The red battle lighting had shifted back to standard white, but the damage control indicators on sections 7 through 9 glowed amber, a reminder that the Carthage had been hit. That first contact had included a weapon strike, that the distance between species was not measured only in light years, but in the fraction of a second between a trigger and a choice. Tran was waiting at the secondary command station. "Report." Marin gave it. The meeting, the handshake, the sphere, the navigational data, the reclassification. Tran absorbed it with the same still-faced precision she brought to everything. But when Marin described the sphere sinking to Voss's heartbeat, the XO's eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but with something that looked, on Commander Lin Tran's carefully neutral face, remarkably like wonder. "They gave us their star charts," Tran said. "A fleet that came to draw a line gave us their star charts. Because we showed them something they hadn't seen before. Not the stealth, not the weapons, the choice." The captain stepped out of a warship unarmed and extended his hand. Tran looked at the main display, where the Kaedrath fleet had reformed into a loose holding pattern, not the tight combat screen of their approach, but an open formation, escorts spaced wide, the flagship's bioluminescent channels pulsing in the slow amber that Marin now knew meant calm. Trust. The fleet that had come to deliver an ultimatum was resting, unhurried, showing its flanks to the Carthage without concern. "Log everything," Tran said. "The burst to fleet command goes out the moment we have relay contact. Command needs to know what happened here before the politics starts." Marin nodded and returned to her station. She began compiling the final sections of the report, the meeting transcript, the sphere's preliminary data analysis, the cultural assessment, the tactical evaluation of the Kaedrath fleet's capabilities, and the rogue escort incident. She wrote it with the precision of a signals officer and the awareness of a woman who understood that the words in this report would shape humanity's posture toward the Kaedrath for generations. She did not editorialize. She did not speculate. She recorded what happened, that a Terran stealth cruiser on routine patrol had received an alien signal, decoded its language, refused its ultimatum, demonstrated its capability, survived an attack, disabled the attacker without killing, offered dialogue, and received in return the navigational heritage of an alien civilization. She let the facts carry their own weight. At 7:30 local, 17 hours after the first signal arrived, the Carthage's communication officer reported that the nearest relay buoy had come within burst range. Voss authorized immediate transmission. The compressed data package, every signal, every translation, every sensor log, every frame of visual recording, and the full text of Marin's report fired across the void at the speed of light, aimed at Terran Stellar Navy Command, carrying the news that would rewrite every strategic assessment, every diplomatic framework, and every assumption humanity had ever made about its place in the universe. The message was gone in 3 seconds. Its consequences would last centuries. Marin watched the transmission confirmation flash on her console and felt something she had not expected. Not triumph, not relief, not the catharsis of a crisis survived. Exhaustion, yes, but beneath it, in the place where the awe had lived and transformed and settled, there was something steadier: purpose. The work was not finished. It was barely begun. The Kaedrath were still out there, 13 functional warships and 1 healing escort, a civilization that had crossed the void to draw a line and instead found a door. The sphere was in the lab, pulsing with Voss's heartbeat frequency, holding the map to 317 new worlds. The translation matrix was incomplete, the shared language still fractured, the diplomatic framework non-existent. There was so much left to build, and building it would require exactly what the last 17 hours had demonstrated: the willingness to hide when hiding served, to fight when fighting was necessary, and to stand in the open when the open was the only place where trust could begin. Marin Solis, signals officer, first human speaker of Kaedrath, saved her report, closed the file, and looked at the main display one final time. The Kaedrath flagship hung in the dark, its bioengineered hull pulsing with the light of a living ship at rest. Beside it, small and battered and unyielding, the Carthage held its position. 2 ships, 2 species, 1 corridor of empty space that was no longer empty, would never be empty again, because something had happened there that neither side could undo and neither side wanted to. The signal had arrived at 3:47. By 7:30, humanity had an ally it had never expected, a language it had never spoken, and a map to a galaxy it had never seen. And the work, the real work, the work that would outlast every ship and every officer and every word in every report, was just beginning.